Hello, and welcome to Akamai's 2018 Spring Release webinar. My name is Jessica Mills, and I am a marketing manager on the developer relations team. I'd like to first thank you all for your time in joining us today to learn about our latest product announcements. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that after our webinar, you will receive a copy of the presentation deck as well as a follow-up email with a recording of today's session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please send that to us via the Q&A module, and we'll have time at the end to answer your questions. But if for any reason we don't have enough time to get to your question, we'll be sure to reach out to you directly. Now let's get started. We're very excited to speak with you today about our 2018 spring release. This is the first time that we've done a release like this, and we plan on having 2 releases per year moving forward, one in the spring and one in the fall, announcing what's new with Akamai and hopefully making it easier to keep up with our new functionalities. Today, we'll cover what's new with web performance, DevOps, and cloud security, as well as a deeper dive into promotional deployment and how to define and protect your APIs at Akamai. We can't cover everything today, but you can check out our 2018 spring release recap, which is linked in the resource list on On24. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today. I'll shortly introduce Sid Tadkar, our product manager within Web Experience, who leads DevOps. Eric Graham, our senior product line director, will then walk us through what's new with cloud security. And Jeff Costa, our senior product manager within Web Experience, will take us through API definitions. Now I'll hand things over to Sid to get started. Sid, take it away.
Thank you, Jess. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining. We are really excited to have you listen to us today and share what we've been working on. Real quick introduction for anyone new to Akamai. We are almost the infrastructure that the internet stands on. A ridiculously disproportionate amount of internet traffic goes through Akamai servers that are located in more than 1,500 locations around the world. And we really pride ourselves on providing tons of capacity in the right spots for the users our customers care about most. And that translates to a lot of data, 77 exabytes of data delivered just last year. In case you're like me, when I first heard about this and you try to gauge how much that is, 1 exabyte translates to 1 million terabytes. And in keeping with the theme of this session, all of that also translated to 102 trillion API hits last year. That's almost 3 million API hits every second. And all of that while keeping our platform completely reliable, secure, and performance-driven. So let's talk about what we've been doing recently. Like Jess mentioned earlier, we are starting a new cadence around 2 big releases a year, a spring release and a fall release. And as part of the recent spring release, we announced a ton of exciting capabilities in our web portfolio. Let me start off by hitting the highlights from 3 big areas that you see on this slide over here. The first one is visibility. In order to even get started with the most strategic decisions on improving your online business outcomes, you need to start off with visibility. And we improved mPulse, which is our real user monitoring solution, with 3 critical capabilities. The first one, insight into perceived performance, so you understand how visual rendering and interactivity affect user behaviors, especially for mobile users. We introduced page construction metrics to provide insight into how that element that you introduced into a user's experience actually impacts your business metrics. And then we introduced middle mile metrics, so you get the most benefit from Akamai by measuring how your apps are being delivered across our platform. Once you have that visibility, you're obviously looking to optimize what you're doing. Our script manager, which is in beta today, will help you mitigate any slowdowns or errors that first or third-party scripts might impose on your website or app, which in turn really works with a lot of other intelligent platform improvements, including what we've done recently around adding support for Broadly at Origin and some improved mobile optimizations. And all of this has to be secure, obviously, so we've added support for TLS 1.3 and an improved certificate provisioning system. Finally, we've also been hard at work improving our image manager solution. We have a new 360-degree media viewer integration. We've added zooming, cropping, overlay, blur, and other image transformations. And we've coupled all of that with dynamic image policies so developers can ensure that image optimization is easier than ever before. That really quick sneak peek did not do justice to how much value just each of these capabilities bring. So if you want to find out more about any of these, bit.ly/akamai-spring-release is the place to go. The last part about developer friendliness was really important because it hits the meta point wherein all of the capabilities that we are building today have this giant focus on developer productivity. So that's what we are going to deep dive on today. We are here to talk DevOps and how we are making our platform even more developer friendly, what this means to you, and we'll also demo some cool stuff. As part of our fall release last year, we introduced a ton of capabilities to help you automate and measure your Akamai operations a lot better. Whether it was bringing down our activation time significantly, purging in seconds, enabling you to manage your config as code, integration with third-party plugins like Terraform or Varnish, just more APIs, there was a lot going on. And as part of our spring release, we are doubling down on that. Three big things that we are super excited about that we are going to chat about today: a new promotional deployment CLI that I will demo, just broadly having the CLI, talking about the CLI, the things we introduced last year, we are building on that, we are hitting more use cases. We've got auto discovery now, so you can start making use of new CLI packages such as fast DNS, interacting with firewall rules. And we've extended a lot of the good DevOps work we've been doing to our security product suite, which Eric will hit on later in the webinar. So let me start off by just talking about promotional deployment. What are we even going for over there? So this new CLI package basically lets you better integrate Akamai configuration changes into your existing CI/CD pipelines by letting you automate that entire process of propagating Akamai changes. Those were a lot of words, so let me dive deeper into it. Let's forget CDN changes for a while. Look at just the top box over there. Every developer we talk to, in terms of any code change they make, they are part of a pipeline today. So you might have a pipeline that is a dev environment, an integration environment, QA environment, finally a production environment. These can be as many or as few as you like, and they could be called anything. But really, the key thing over here is there are different stages you'd go through as you look to deploy your code. Typically, what would happen is you'd make a change in your lowest environment, then run a bunch of tests to test out this change, promote it to your next environment, integration in this case, run a bunch of tests, promote it to your next environment, and so on and on. That is also, in terms of a CI/CD pipeline, that entire process might also be completely automated via a Jenkins, Circle CI, Travis CI, some kind of a build automation job. Let's then bring it to CDN and Akamai changes. Until today, what happened was the developers we spoke to had a similar pipeline for their CDN changes, and they'd want to test out any configuration changes as they went through that pipeline. So as a developer, I'd make a change in my lowest environment, in this case in one, assume it's just a really simple caching rule change. I then test it out, promote it to the next one, that's the gray area over there, test it out, manually apply it to the next environment, and until today, the thing we really had was the pain point was the gray arrows over there. Every time you went from one environment to another, those changes that you made had to be manually reapplied every time. So those gray arrows essentially translated into a lot of time spent onto these, a lot of even professional services hours. If your configuration file is complex or extremely big, you get into a lot of the scope of getting into a lot of manual errors. And what we are trying to do with promotional deployment is really get away from that pain. The blue arrows that you see over there are what we are providing, wherein all we are doing is, if you make a change in your lowest environment, you can now seamlessly promote it to your higher environment. There's no manual intervention required here. You could completely automate that whole process, so it's just as seamless as you want. You could, again, you put in that entire process into a build automation pipeline of your choice, but really a lot of good things it gives you. One is obviously that ability for more automation, a lot more self-serviceability, that ability to just the scope of introducing manual errors goes down ridiculously. Really a lot of time to do just about anything you want, a lot more productivity. As with anything in life, a demo is always a lot more helpful than PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to switch over to my terminal and show you how this actually works. So I switched over to my terminal. Like I mentioned before, the promotional deployment CLI is just another package within our Akamai CLI. What this Akamai CLI does is really give you a single automatable command that you can integrate anywhere to satisfy use cases you care about the most. Three things I'm going to show you in this demo itself. The first is, how do you install and get set up with the promotional deployment package? Second one is, how do you create your existing pipeline so you can integrate Akamai changes within it? And finally, the easiest part, how do you just keep running that process of promotion, automate it, do it as many times as you like. So let me first spend a couple of minutes for anyone who's new to the Akamai CLI around what that is. Like I mentioned, what it does is it really gives you this automatable component wherein you can integrate it to any use cases that you care about. So for example, I'll pick a use case here. Let's say I have a site, www.sidstaqueria.com. It's a site that sells tacos. Let's say I have a configuration for it that I want to retrieve. All I would do over here is an Akamai property retrieve. Give it my configuration name. It's going to look inside, and it pulls out my set of rules for my configuration. So again, really simple, something that can be automated anywhere, anytime. We have a lot of existing capabilities for purging content, activating your configurations, visitor prioritizations. Like I mentioned previously, we introduced more use cases around setting firewall rules, fast DNS, a lot of goodness to go along with it. But I digress. So let me get back to the promotional deployment demo itself. If you already have this CLI, installing promotional deployment is extremely easy. All I'm going to do is an Akamai install promotional deployment. It's going to complain because the package already exists for me, but that's going to install the promotional deployment package for you. One quick note, right now we are in our beta period, so for the next 3 months, if you do want this package, you won't see it, but you can get in touch with us and we'll get you up and set up and running so we can make this happen for your CLI. So now let me check whether what my promotional deployment CLI does. I'm going to do an Akamai help just to verify whether it's installed. I look at my installed packages. I see property management, purge, visitor prioritization, and promotional deployment is in there. I run a help on the promotional deployment package. Looks like it does a lot of cool things. I won't get into all of it. Two big things that I really want to hit upon, like I mentioned before, is one is how do I replicate an existing pipeline, and then how does that promotion process work? So let me start off by just creating or replicating a pipeline. I'm going to make the assumption that the pipeline I'm creating is based off an existing configuration file I have. I've got three environments in there, dev, QA, and prod. And the only thing that's different between this is my origin host name. What I'm going to do over here is run an Akamai new pipeline command. I'm going to pass it a pipeline name. So let's just call it demo 100. I'll pass it a bunch of account-specific information. If you don't already know this, it's really easy to pull out this information using the CLI itself. Once you become generally available, all you need to put in is your configuration name, and the CLI just auto-discovers all of this for you. And then in the end, you'll see that I'm setting up three things over here. I want the pipeline to have a dev environment, a QA environment, and finally, my prod environment. And those are the three things I set up over there. So I hit enter. This process should take about 20 seconds. And what it's doing in the backend is creating this backend folder structure that, one, lets me define my environments, and two, make any changes that I want to make across my pipeline and promote them. So that's done. I go to my local repository. I see demo 100 over here. You see a bunch of directories. The first thing I do is go into my environments directory to just define my environments. I have a generic variables definition file over here that generates a bunch of content. Like I mentioned, the only thing that's different across my environment is my origin host name. So I'm going to leave that as null over here. Everything else you can define over here or just simply leave it as it is. The one thing to note over here is if you have other variables in your that differ across your environment, you're not just restricted to these three. You can always parameterize them and then add it to this file, so you can then start defining more environment-specific variables. And I now go into my individual environments to start defining how they actually are. So for my dev environment, I define my origin host name. Do the same thing for my QA environment. And then finally do the same thing for my production environment. And that really is it. That's the one-time setup you need to do to make sure your pipeline's all good. I'm going to check if my environments are set up properly. Akamai promotional deployment, demo 100, give me the status, and it tells me about the three environments that I have. We've spoken to different users have different needs over here. So some users that we speak to set this pipeline up once and forget about it forever. Other users have a cadence wherein this pipeline changes every month, every 2 weeks. They might have multiple pipelines at once. You have the ability to be as creative as is. I'm going to show you how I make a configuration change and then how I promote this across my pipelines. I'm going to go back to this templates directory over here. What the promotional deployment CLI does this really cool thing wherein it breaks your configuration file into a bunch of top-level rule snippets. So what it's done over here is it's broken down my config for template that I've generated all of these things from. And assume I want to make the simplest change. I want to make a change in how my caching TTLs. I go into my cache extensions file. I see it's set to 1 day over here. I switch it to 1 minute, and that's it. My change is made. I go back to my terminal, and I'm going to run an Akamai promote over here. I give it my pipeline name. I want to promote this to my dev environment, so I give it dev in here. I want it to notify me when my promotion is done, so I give it my email address as well. And what this promote command really is doing in the backend is it's picking up the change I just made. It's updating my set of rules with that, saving that change, and then activating it and putting it in my dev environment. If you do want, the promotional deployment CLI has a bunch of things in the back end which lets you save individually, merge this individually. However, if you just simply use the promote command, you don't need to do any of this separately. And the promote command really is the crux of promotional deployment, like I mentioned before. What it's doing over there is once you make that initial change, you can just simply keep promoting that change. So in this case, I promoted it to my dev environment. Once that's activated, I've then promoted to my QA environment. I'm not changing anything here except just telling it that I want the change to then be promoted to my QA environment. And when it's time to promote it to my prod environment, I'm going to run the same command with prod in there. So really, that is the value of promotional deployment, wherein once everything's set up, you can simply automate this entire command. You can use a Jenkins build job or something to just put this command in there. So every time you run a test in your local environment, all it does is if everything's fine, it picks it up, runs this command, and your change is promoted to the next environment. Essentially, that one single command gets rid of a lot of the professional services hours, a lot of time you spend on reapplying these changes across your environment, a lot of the risk of introducing manual errors, and that really is the crux of promotional deployment. I'm going to go back to how you can get involved with promotional deployment. So that was the demo that we just saw. If you are interested in this cool new capability, we are in beta today. We are going to be in beta for the next 3 months and then make this generally available to everyone. So it's just another CLI package. bit.ly/Akamai PD is where you can go to just put in your beta interest or just send us a message after this session is done. I'm now going to pass it along, and like I said before, this is just one of the many things we are doing across our DevOps capabilities. We are also doing a bunch of stuff with our cloud security products as well. So let me pass it along to Eric, who will walk you through what we have been doing with that.
All right, we have a lot to share in cloud security across the portfolio. This spring, we've made significant updates in each of the product areas. I'll talk to these real quick, and then I have a few where we'll jump in over the coming minutes. In the DDoS mitigation, we want to ensure that you're able to absorb the biggest attacks on the internet. That comes across as additional scrubbing centers, more place for us to take that bad traffic and scrub it out of your traffic that's delivered. The greater than a gig per tunnel is all about getting that clean traffic from our scrubbing center back to you and making sure that as your legitimate traffic volumes grow, your ability to get all of that cleanly out of our scrubbing infrastructure grows as well. And then IPv6, we're starting to see attacks, DDoS volumetric attacks that are actually sourced from IPv6 attackers. So as the attackers change, so do we. And we've been updating our capabilities to scrub and mitigate those attacks. Security analytics is all about insights and understanding what's going on with your security at Akamai. The routed dashboard shows you how you're connected to those scrub centers and the health of those tunnels that deliver the clean traffic back to your own infrastructure. Our web security analytics, I'm going to go into in more detail in just a moment, so I'm going to skip over it. And then client reputation, which is our service that says, hey, is this client a risk for me, is receiving significant upgrades. We're going to have a new UI. I'll show you that in a moment. And the risk scores. We're tailoring the risk scores so they are more accurate for you in your particular business and property online. In application security, many of you likely noticed already, we're making lots of progress in updating our configuration experience and making that easier to use and more fluid. As we do that, we're changing the underlying application so that we can expose configuration APIs to you in a command line interface, like what Sid just showed us, specific for app security. And then a critical part of any application in a modern architecture is the API. So how you expose your APIs to end users is absolutely foundational to how you protect them from malicious attackers at Akamai and how you protect them from bots. Jeff will show us more about that in a moment. On bots, we've rounded out the capabilities to ensure that you can protect all of your experiences, and we've plugged it into our SIM API so that you can see the security events generated by Bot Manager wherever you choose to ingest those security events. Let me show you Web Security Analytics. If you haven't seen it before, this is the side-by-side. On the left, security monitors the UI that most of you are likely familiar with today. On the right is the new Web Security Analytics. This is going to show you a prior month's worth of security events, and it's going to let you slice and dice and drill down. So let me show you that. The spark lines along the bottom are there so you can quickly see a trend. And each one of these rows you can select and add that to a query. So I'm going to do so. Let's drill into what's happening with the WAF security events. And then along the left, that whole set of navigation are dimensions that you can use to sort the view. So in this case, I've selected the country. I want to see the country where the request came from. And in this example, you can see Sweden. There's something wrong in the Kingdom of Sweden, and we want to drill into that. So I add Sweden to my drill down, and I've changed now to look at the WAF rule IDs, so the specific rules that are triggering. And you can see there's 3 of them down there. I just picked one arbitrarily to drill into here. So I've now started in from a month's view of data, said for traffic from Sweden that is matching this WAF rule, show me those requests. Wouldn't it be great if I could see some of the raw log lines and details about specific requests that match that criteria? That's what the sample log view is for, up at the top. Once I click that, I get this view, which shows me across the top individual requests, and each request I select are going to change the layout and the information in the headers, the client information, and the rules below. And since this is a primary operational interface for a lot of our customers, we spent a lot of time thinking about how you would want to customize this and lay it out for your day-to-day operations. So you can see from the orange highlighted box, you can open up a menu and you can customize how all these panels are laid out, and you can pull them out into different windows if you're working across different screens. All of this to make sure that you can find and drill down to the most relevant information quickly. One last thing on Web Security Analytics, a new UI element, there's a feedback button in the top right. As we go through all this effort to update the user experience, we want feedback. So tell us what's working, what's not working. If you run into something that you think is great, please tell us. If you run into something that could have been better, please tell us. That goes straight to our product team, and we watch that closely. On the configuration experience, we've just completed step 2 of our 4 planned steps to overhaul everything in that security configuration. And you can learn more about this out on the community. There's a bit.ly link at the bottom here that will be present in the slides as well that takes you to a screen-by-screen walkthrough of what we've done to make this easier to use so you can get to configuring your security posture faster. On client reputation, this is again a side-by-side of the current view on the left and the new view on the right. One of the things that we want to ensure we're doing is empower you with as much knowledge as we can based off of our visibility of traffic across the internet. It's amazing the insights that we are able to gain by virtue of our customers and your end users. And we use that and manifest that in these risk scores that we expose to you in client reputation. In the new panel, we're going to make it easier to understand for any given client IP, not just what's their score, but why do they have that score, and why do they have that risk score for you? What we see with attack campaigns is that they can be highly focused on an industry or a country or a domain, And that changes the risk that that client represents to you. So with the new one, you can see the hosts, domains, industry sectors, countries, and customers. You can see how the reputation across the different risk scores we provide has changed with time. And for each one of those at the bottom, you can see the specific events, both for you and anonymized across other customers, of what this client has done to earn them that score. Now, stepping away from the UI for a moment, the API powers all of it. Underneath our UI is a set of APIs that you're actually driving when you configure the product. We've been opening those up for you to use as well. So we're excited to announce our initial application security API. It's available out on developer.akamai.com right now in beta. With the API, we've also introduced a command line interface. So there's an Akamai AppSec command that you can load into the CLI. We're going to add a lot of functionality to this over the coming months. We're just getting started, but we're excited about what this does for letting you programmatically manage your security posture. So there's a blog out there that you can go, and I will walk you step by step through how to use one of our containers that has the CLI installed to pull down the AppSec command and start interacting with your security configurations at Akamai. Bots. Dealing with automated users. It's a big problem. It's a big challenge. And over the last couple of years, we've become really good at identifying bots when they're coming through a browser. And as we've become really good at identifying those bots coming through browsers, the malicious bots have started coming straight to the API, and in some cases even driving the mobile application. With the spring release, we're introducing our SDK for Bot Manager Premier. This lets you bake in Akamai's protections to your iOS and Android applications so that we can protect not just the browser-driven experiences, but those that come through a mobile application as well from the most sophisticated bot actors out there. Now, there's a lot that's changing in our experience, whether that's in the UI or in the APIs. And that's come from listening to all of you, and we want more. We love feedback. So if you're interested in participating in a working group, we have a user experience working group for our cloud security products. And if you follow the link on screen, that'll take you to a forum where you can apply to be part of that. And for the people that join that, my team and I, working with our user researchers, contact you as we work through our different projects to do things like brainstorm how an experience should be laid out, refine wireframes, and play with prototypes to make sure that we're building something that you can use for real every day. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff Costa to show us what's new in API definitions.
Thank you, Eric. So the first topic we're going to talk about today is Swagger. So Akamai has adopted Swagger and RAML, which are called API definition languages, to make it really easy to onboard your APIs to Akamai. If you don't know Swagger and you haven't been introduced to it, it's a simple, structured way to describe an API. It's like creating the blueprint before you start pouring concrete for your house. A lot of our customers are doing what's called design-first development, wherein they will write this API definition before they write a single line of code. And you can do some pretty amazing things with a Swagger file. You can, first of all, automatically generate API documentation, which, as we all know, no developer likes to write documentation. But this tool actually helps you create that automatically. It creates both human in YAML format and machine-readable in JSON format structured text files. And those text files can be passed around within your company to partners or posted in GitHub on the open internet like many of our companies do today, many of our customers do today. And it really gives someone who's consuming your API everything they need to know about how to use your API. And it's worth noting that the name of Swagger has been rebadged to the Open API Initiative. So you'll sometimes hear it called Open API or Swagger 3 and so forth, but they are actually interchangeable names. But the going forward name is the Open API Initiative. And a design-first example is sort of what you're seeing here, is on the left, I've got a Swagger file for a pet store API. I then can use, after I write this Swagger file, I can use this file to then inform the Node.js code that I'm showing on the right for that same API. I can see the methods, I can see the functions and the parameters, all of that reflected in the code, basically because I've taken the time to create the Swagger file from the start. And as I said, these are human and machine readable. So here's a great example of a YAML file that obviously you can read pretty easily. It's simply indented text. And the indentions mean what you would think they mean. That is how the hierarchy of the file is built. You can also write it in JSON, which can be a little harder to read for some people, largely because it has the brackets, but it's the same style, right? You have structured text that can easily be read. And why do you even use Swagger? Well, I've kind of touched on some of this a moment ago. The integration with other REST APIs can sometimes be very troublesome and often inconsistent. People write things in different ways, right? So if you're looking at the REST semantics from a partner who is sharing their API with you, it can vary pretty widely. It can also vary sometimes by the language that is being used to write an API. Documentation, as I mentioned a moment ago, is typically an afterthought, right? So if you have a Swagger file, it is a form of documentation that is almost self-describing. And then a lot of times the way people learn about your API is through trial and error. Try this input parameter. See what this value is, if this value is allowed. See what responses are coming back. But so in other words, it's a real pain in the butt to try to do this without Swagger. So this is an example Swagger file. And as you see here, it's got a number of different sections. The first section is metadata, data about data. In this case, data about the API itself. I'm going to show you one of these here in a moment. Then you have data, another section in the middle that is really information about the API request. And then below that, the API response. And you can kind of make a rough analogy here that the Swagger file is akin to a sitemap for your API. And we use these Swagger files in a very, very specific way at Akamai. We allow you to take an API definition, ingest it at the edge, and then we will automatically know all the details about your API. We understand its endpoints, its resources, the HTTP verbs that it uses, and so forth. And by doing so, you save that step of manually defining an API at Akamai. You simply ingest this file. We can point either to a URL or a file on disk. And then you can start wrapping Akamai services around your APIs. This could not be simpler. So that's all I had on the slides. Let's actually take a look at what this looks like in action. So I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. And we'll take a look at, first, a Swagger file. So this is a great example of what I was showing you in the slides. This is a YAML file. And as you can see here, here's that metadata that I was speaking of. Here's the version of the Swagger file, the title, and of course the description. What does this API do? Well, it's a sample API of a pet store. Of course, you've got the license for it. And down here you start getting into the meat of the API. You've got the host name, petstore.swagger.io. You've got the base path of the API, what it consumes and produces in terms of output formats. And then down here you start getting into the paths of the API. Again, notice the indented text that I have a pets endpoint. It supports the get HTTP verb. And it does exactly what you would think it does. It returns all pets from the system. And then down here are the parameters that it takes. such as name, a name parameter with a value of tags that can be found in the query string. And then down here, if I scroll down a little further, you've got the responses that are emitted from this GET request. So this is a 200 response with a description, and it's coming out as an array. As you can see, or hopefully you're starting to see, this is the blueprint for the API. And once I write this almost pseudocode, then it's very, very easy to be able to take this and build real code around it. As I scroll down, we'll finish through this real quick. It's got a post command as well to, again, do what you think it might do, creating a new pet in the pet store. And as I go down, that post command, the next resource after the post for the pets is pets ID to be able to return a user, or in this case a pet, by their unique ID. And that, of course, has a get and a delete in terms of the verbs, and that's about the end of the file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to minimize that, and I'm going to take you into the Luna Control Center. I want to make a very, very strong point that I'm showing you this in a GUI, but there is also a very, very rich set of APIs that we have published that allow you to do this certainly programmatically and from a CLI interface or from a typical command line interface. So if I go to developer.akamai.com/API, you get our API catalog. And if I scroll down here, the API that I'm speaking of is called the Endpoints API. And if I go in here and show you the resources for that API, all the things I'm about to show you in the GUI, you can accomplish via API calls. So we've written, as you can see here, a very, very rich interface to be able to control all aspects of your endpoints at Akamai. Let's go flip back over here to Luna Control Center. So this is our interface for registering or defining an API at Akamai. You have a brand new interface to do this. This is actually outside of the Property Manager interface. If you've heard us use that word, if you're an Akamai veteran, you've probably heard that. And this serves one really important function. It allows an API developer's changes to be decoupled from any sort of infrastructure-related changes that would occur in Property Manager. This was actually a deliberate design choice we made, such that you don't give an API developer the ability to, for example, inadvertently step on an SSL certificate or change a DNS host name or some sort of infrastructure. You can accomplish all of the typical tasks right here in this interface. And as you can see here, we're surfacing things like API name, base path, the last time this configuration of the API was modified on the Akamai platform. So let's show you how to bring an API on. You saw this in a slide. If I click on Register API, I can certainly type in all of this data manually. I can give the API a name, a base path, a host name, and so forth. There are no resources. I could go ahead and click this plus sign, and I can add resources and give it a name and a path, and then set up a get command, add some parameters to that. I actually don't want to do this. This is manual, this is painful, and we think there's a better way. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that resource that I created. And notice how I'm actually being prompted for an API name. We're going to give it one, but we're going to do it with that API definition, that YAML file written in Swagger format that I just showed you. So if I click on Import API, it automatically defaults to Swagger. And again, I can point to a URL if this Swagger file is published somewhere that we can retrieve it, or on a file. So I'm going to go ahead and say Choose File. And from my file system, I'm going to pick up petstoresimple.yaml and click Open. The file name shows up here. And then I simply click Import. And as you can see here, a bunch of information just flashed on the screen. But what you also should have noticed is all of these fields are suddenly filled out. The API now has a name, a base path, a description. It has a host name. And down here, I have the two API resources that I took you through when we were looking at the Swagger file. So if I open these up and open this caret up for pets, you'll notice that I do have the pets resource, and here are my get and post methods. If I open up get, notice that instantly you have all of that information populated. Here's that tags parameter, and it's found in a query string. You could easily change that, and so forth. It's a parameter of type string. When I come down here, here's the other parameter is limit. And this one also is found in a query string. This one's an integer. And this is where the positive security model of Kona actually starts coming into play. So if I wanted to say, you know what, I know this API should not accept an integer that is higher than 20. I can set a max of 1 and a high of 20. Let's just arbitrarily choose those numbers. And I can say this is required. And now when the edge gets a request for this API, it's going to look at the query string parameter. And if it sees a 21 here as the integer value for the limit parameter, it is going to block that request at the edge. Positive security. For the post command down here, if I open that up, I get a very similar set of features, but it looks a little bit different because we're actually dealing with a post body here, not a GET request. So I can actually set some of the same type of parameters for the post body. Here's the name, here's the type, I can set the length, and so forth. There are other features here, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of both of those. I'm going to go ahead and collapse pets. And then if I open up Pets ID, you'll notice, once again, we have ingested that same information that you saw in that file. Here's the delete command with its parameters, and of course the get command with its parameters. So this saves you a lot of manual work. You simply have to hand Akamai one single file, and we take care of all the rest. That's it for my demo today. I'm going to switch back over to our next presenter.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So that wraps it up for what Sid, Eric, and Jeff were going to cover. We're ready to now dive into some Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to still put them in the Q&A module. But first question we have, this one I think would be for you, Sid, or actually the whole team. How do we keep up with all the capabilities that you have coming out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So developer.akamai.com is where we post up-to-date information about all of these capabilities that are coming up. We've got a blog in there where we blog about what's new, how use cases, a bunch of other things. We have a section around DevOps over there. We have a lot of these APIs that we talked about in there. Follow that. The developer account also has some social media accounts on Twitter, on Facebook. Best way is simply to follow developer.akamai.com.
Great. And one question that is for you, Jeff. Are you writing API definitions before or after you create an API?
That is a fantastic question. You can do either one. The design first mentality says that you write them before you write a line of code. There is, however, tooling available that allows you to add a bit of code that will help mark up that code and generate these from existing code. If you go to swagger.io, you'll find that there is a bunch of tool sets there that will help you create these files. It's probably best to create them from hand, at least to get started, because you can actually spend some time learning the tool. For those who haven't seen it, let me just take a moment and I'll share my screen again to kind of give you a little bit more visual of what I'm talking about here. Bear with me just for a moment. It's certainly something you can do either way. The preference is yours. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see this. So if you go to swagger.io, this is the website for all things Swagger. If I go up here to Tools and go to Swagger Editor, I have a couple of different online editors I can use. Well, I have a couple different editors. One is online, one is downloadable. Swagger CodeGen is kind of what I'm talking about here. You can actually use this to help build the stubs that we're talking about here. But if I look at the editor, just to give you some sense of this, and I go to the online editor itself, it's going to open this in one single place. And what you should notice here is that this is a Swagger file, and this is a typical file that's in YAML format, and you see that we have paths, and this one's a little different than what we had before. But notice here, the documentation is automatically created. This is a huge win for Swagger. So not only does it help you on onboarding APIs to Akamai, but you get a lot of additional benefits, like the ability to just have documentation created. See how this, if I just open that up, it has the parameters, the responses, what success looks like. You can even usually, depending on how you're doing this, make a mock call and try it out. See how I clicked the try it out button? I said execute. I'm not going to bother with that at the moment, but you get the idea. Notice also that it has an error feature. It says, hey, we've got a problem here at line 26, and here's the problem. I can't resolve a reference. This is another great tool for the reason of you can actually write files, and if you have problems anywhere in this, it'll flag you with this nice, obnoxiously pink box that will show you exactly where those errors are, and it will allow you to, it'll give you some guidelines on how to create them. So if you are creating these for the first time on a manual basis, this is a great tool to do it because it actually will make sure that you're building these according to the syntax that is required by the Swagger spec. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to a question, Jess, but hopefully it provided the information we were looking for.
It was a great answer. Thanks, Jeff. Question now for Sid. Do you have best practices on how users have set up pipelines?
That's a good question. It really comes down to your specific environment needs. We've got users who, as I mentioned before, we've got users who set up a pipeline every month and want to keep changing this. And we've got users who set up a pipeline forever. We've also got some users who set up a pipeline. They might have, even within their environments, they might have some kind of a traffic sharing scenario. So you could have a pipeline within a pipeline. What the promotional deployment CLI does is it creates these properties at the back end that are based off the configuration template you provided. So as long as you have a process or you know how you're keeping everything in sync, you can be as creative around these as you want.
Great. And one other question that is for you, Jeff. How do you update definitions? Will uploading a new Swagger file overwrite existing settings completely?
Yep, today they do. Today it's an overwrite. What we're working on is a workflow to be able to tell Akamai, and when you have a change in your Swagger file, retain these settings, but change these other settings. So that's something that we're working on right now, because those files change on, I would call it a semi-regular basis. The most frequent we've seen them change is usually twice a month. But that's something that we certainly have some work to do here to make that experience a lot easier. And just to give this team one other reference here, let me just share my screen again. Sorry, Jess, I'm stealing your thunder here just for a moment. But I think a couple of questions have been asked about how do I actually do this? How do I build Swagger and RAML? And there's a great little article here on, of course, swagger.io, why you should create an API definition and how to do it. And we already talked about the whys, but there's a couple different methods here I wanted to point out to this audience. First, of course, the design first approach, write the definition first. There's also a great tool that they just created called Swagger Inspector, which you can plug in an API call and it will actually generate the Swagger for you. It's pretty slick. And then you can do some code-generated definitions as well. So Swagger, SmartBear, who actually is the administrator of Swagger, has Swagger cores, which you can use with Java. But there's other ones as well. There's Scala, there's .NET, there's Node.js. So there's a bunch of different tools out there that will allow you to integrate with your existing code and create that definition from what you already have. Back to you, Jess.
Great. Awesome. And Sid, a question for you. With promotional deployment CLI, is it possible to add or modify user templates, rules, and behaviors and not just values?
Yeah, so today with the promotional deployment CLI, you can modify. Adding won't be possible. That's something we are looking at, but right now it's just modifying a bunch of rule templates. The one exception is if you do have some kind of logged behaviors in there, those will need to be converted into custom behaviors before you can start modifying them.
Great. And another one for you, Sid. Does the CLI demos call APIs that can be used instead of using the CLI? Is that a recommended practice?
Yes, so everything the CLI did just now is just calling a bunch of API calls beneath. So if you have used our Property Manager API, all of these API calls that we are using are on developer.akamai.com/API, and you'll see the Property Management API over there. So it's just aggregating everything versus doing anything new. The recommended practice really, again, comes down to your specific environment needs. The reason we created this CLI is we got a lot of user inputs around that, but if you want to make it even more customized, you can simply call on these underlying APIs.
Great. And I think, Eric, there was one question that we might want to just bring to the broader team around what's the current protection for mobile apps and what's new?
Sure. So with the mobile apps and what's new in the spring release is the ability to bring our behavioral profiling to understand if the user of that application is an automated user or an actual human. As we've become really good at helping all of you identify automated users doing credential abuse and account takeover on websites, we've seen the attackers shift to the mobile apps. So with the SDK, you can build us into the mobile app, and we can provide the same protections there.
Great. And last question that we have time for. Sid, can I set up multiple promotional deployment pipelines at the same time?
You can, yeah. As long as you're careful around making sure you're not tangling yourself into updating the same config in different ways, and as long as you keep them separate or have some kind of a cadence to make sure everything's in sync, you can create multiple pipelines. Great.
That's about all that we have time for, but if anyone else has questions, still feel free to enter them in the module and we'll reach out to you directly. After this webinar, we will also be sending a recording of this as well as resources that will drive you to more information about the 2018 spring release. Thank you all again for your time. We've had a great time talking about the spring release, and we can't wait for the fall.